Thank you, thank you. Hello, I'm going to try to get through it as quickly as possible so that we can have some time for questions. I will start with what is, in my practice, often a regular disclaimer, which is that this is very much a work in progress. So my selfish ask of you is to engage me and give me feedback. And also, there's a lot that I'm interested in that I do not have skills for, so if anyone is interested in this and wants to collaborate, I'm open to that. That would be really fun. So that's my beginning pitch that is selfish. Hello, I am Jennifer Terrell. I'm from Indiana University. I have a PhD in something called Informatics. How many people in this room know what that is? That's what I thought. So I thought I would tell you a little bit about what that is. Thank you for those who do know, so that you can have a little bit of a sense of who I am and where I'm coming from. I'm from the Luddy School of Informatics, Computing, and Engineering. I am not a computer scientist or an engineer. I am somebody who studies people using technology. My background is in a little bit computer science and cultural anthropology, and then this. So we train our students to collaboratively evaluate and solve problems using a combination of computational thinking, sociotechnical thinking, and design thinking skills. And I imagine that when I say that, you can immediately think about maybe what computational thinking is. Spoilers, it's how to solve problems with computers. And I imagine that most people in this room know about design thinking, but maybe that sociotechnical thinking, maybe that part's kind of new. And so in a minute, I'll give you a definition of what that is. I am one of the faculty who teach the multidisciplinary electives that Logan Zwiecki talked to us about last year. So this is my class. I'm going to Disney World, and within a computing and engineering school, I teach a class on immersive storytelling and experience design. I'm mostly doing so to students who have no desire to actually work in themed entertainment. Most of my students are human-computer interaction students and learning design from that aspect. In addition to this class, I also get to teach there's a couple other classes that I teach, but the one that I want to tell you about that's important here is a class on popular culture and technology ethics. So I've been thinking about the relationship between the stories that we tell and the ethics that we hold for quite a while. So not quite a while, a little while. Here's my agenda. I will talk about what my research questions are. We'll get to some definitions. We'll talk about methodologies. In the abstract, I said I was going to go through 2 attractions. I don't have time for that, so I'm not going through 2 attractions. And then I'll talk a little bit about future work, and maybe you can imagine yourself coming to hang out with me and to do that. So generally for the last several years, I've been interested in what is the role of storytelling in the construction of our sociotechnical ethics. I'll get to that sociotechnical word in just a minute. We can start with a platform that says we know, and I think we're all on the same page here, that stories can shape ethical decision-making of everyday people. Here I have a screenshot referencing one of my favorite anthropologists, Genevieve Bell, who will trace a history of how people think about artificial intelligence related to stories. So starting with the Luddites and Ned Ludd and the Luddite movement, and going to Frankenstein, and eventually going to Asimov and other science fiction, and how does that shape why people are afraid of artificial intelligence. Here's a book that contains a chapter of someone who makes an argument that the movie Star Wars and games of the same time period, such as Battlefield and Space Invaders, helped people be primed to accept new various defense programs from the government, etc., during the early 80s. We have the fact that President Ronald Reagan, after watching the movie War Games, said, "Is this possible?" And when some of his advisors said, "Maybe," he started the first federally funded cybersecurity programs in response to his response of watching the movie War Games. We know that stories can be transformative in that way, and we also know that story attractions and immersive attractions can thus offer similar impactful experience, eliciting strong emotions, etc. We know that those stories can be transformative, and we just heard from Joe Pine about how that can happen and what that transformation in audiences could be. However, I don't think we know it all yet. And in my head, if I didn't have to upload these slides by Wednesday, I would have reworded this and reworded this. But there's a couple of howevers. One is I don't think we fully understand how transformation may or may not happen. And we know that 5 people experiencing an attraction don't experience it exactly the same way. And so I'd like to know more about how that may or may not happen. And in the conversations I've had this week, I think I can firmly say that some people still view story-based attractions as an escape from the real world and not necessarily connected to it. And so I think that that notion is still under contestation, and we can explore it further. And because we can explore it further, and that's what I'm interested in, I have a thing that I want to share with you that comes from my field of science and technology studies, which is very closely related to informatics. And that thing is a concept called Sociotechnical Imaginaries. And I think that Sociotechnical Imaginaries can be an important tool in continuing the research for thinking about how transformation in audiences may or may not happen, how it happens, etc. So now I'll get to defining sociotechnical. In its simplest form, sociotechnical is just an adjective that describes something as simultaneously social and technical. In most of my role as a faculty member at Indiana University, that's what I teach people. I teach people sociotechnical thinking and thinking about the relationship between people, norms, culture, values, and technologies. And they are never separated. They're always interconnected. And I'm increasingly playing with this concept called an imaginary. And I think a lot of people use the word imaginary in this sort of classical form as an adjective describing something as make-believe, and that's not what we're talking about here. We're not talking about the adjective form of imaginary. Instead, we're going to talk about an imaginary, or imaginaries in the plural, as a noun or a set of nouns. And imaginaries are ideals held by everyday people. We all have them. They're the things that sort of shape our world. And some subsections of imaginaries, Charles Taylor talks about social imaginaries, which is our way of being social creatures in the world, how we imagine and understand our existence, that we can only understand our existence through imagination. Again, not make-believe, real, but still the thing that helps us do that, how we figure out norms, how we figure out how to interact, etc. Benedict Anderson says that nation states only exist in our imagination, and it is our collective imagining of them that makes them real through the stories that we tell, through the maps that we draw, through the laws that we enact, etc. And Jasanoff and Kim in science and technology studies take this to a place of thinking about sociotechnical imaginaries. And I know I have a bunch of words on here. I'm not going to read them to you. I'm going to give you my understanding of it, but you can read the words at the same time if you'd like. Which is that sociotechnical imaginaries are ways of understanding what people and technology together should or should not do. Bob gave us that artificial intelligence is a threat, right? An opportunity and a threat, right? That's an understanding of the role of artificial intelligence and what it should or should not do. And so we have these imaginaries about these relationships and what should and should not happen. Some things that you should know about imaginaries: one, they're always normative. They're about what should or should not happen. They're not necessarily descriptive about what is or isn't. They're very closely tied to morals and values, and as a person who teaches ethics, I think about that a lot. They're collectively held. There's not an imaginary that only exists within one person. And at the same time, there's probably not an imaginary that is completely universal, that exists amongst all people. For example, we may all agree that murder is wrong, but we may very much disagree about when killing is murder or not, right? So it becomes hard to say if that's universally held. Lastly, and importantly to me, imaginaries are made visible in action, what people do, right? What do people do? How they believe, how they see themselves, how they understand the world, that's all made visible in action. As I became introduced to the themed entertainment world, which happened relatively recently in my academic career, I modified my research question, and I'm really interested now in what is the role of embodied experience and storytelling through story attractions in the construction of our sociotechnical ethics. That is to say, like, I'm thinking about that transformation, but in particular to ethics. And I think that this concept called sociotechnical imaginaries can help us understand a little bit of the piece of that puzzle. I was really inspired by this understanding of experience that takes physiological responses in our body into account when we think about, yes, emotion and memory translate into experience, but like what's happening within us. Now, I don't have a degree in neuroscience, so if anybody else does and they want to nerd out with me on this, that would be great. But that's what made me start to think about what does it mean for embodied stories to do this. So How did I do this? My work right now is autoethnographic, meaning that I went and experienced and reflected, etc. I'm an ethnographer by training, meaning I usually go observe and participate and draw conclusions from talking to people. My work is so far focused on Disney theme parks in particular, in part because of the strong national identity that is tied to Disney theme parks historically, in part because that is also tied to science and technology, because American identity is closely tied to science and technology. There's not going to be time for questions. See me at lunch. And in part because of my own familiarity with Disney parks in particular. I have selected story attractions that are clearly related to science and technology. I would not say that all story attractions do this. So I'll talk a little bit about Flight of Passage, which, given that I have 4.5 minutes, I hope you're pretty familiar with. Some sociotechnical imaginaries that could come away, that audiences could come away with from Flight of Passage could include things like everyone should invest in conservation of keystone species for the well-being of all. They might think it is wrong to exploit a natural environment for private gain. They might think it is important to rise to challenges and explore your own boundaries or the boundaries around you, to be brave. I'm going to focus on one of those to think through how Flight of Passage does this. We could think about it is wrong to exploit the natural environment for private gain, and as you walk through the queue, if you're paying attention, which not all guests are, you can see this tension really clearly between natural environments and technical environments or built environments, and usually the natural environment is taking over, right? And so we can establish this imaginary immediately through this tension that is in the queue. And as we move into the science lab portion of the queue, the signs that are present and the theming remind us about the importance of that conservation. I hope you're familiar with the pre-show, because I'm not going to read this to you, but the pre-show also does that through direct script in terms of reminding us why we're there and the story that is about to unfold. When you experience that story, for many people, one of the emotions evoked is empathy. For me, empathy for a creature that doesn't exist, an Ikran or a Banshee. I grew up riding horses, and so for me that felt very familiar. We might have empathy for Na'vi, which are also creatures that don't exist. Unclear to me if we have empathy for the avatars. I don't hear people talking about that, but I'd love to talk about that. And how does that happen? That happens in part through this ride vehicle, right? When you actually sit in a position where you feel this creature breathing, it provokes an emotional response, and it feels very real, and I can attest to that because that's exactly how it feels when a horse breathes when I am riding that horse, right? And so we get this emotional response that creates this empathy. Humans make meaning from the world around them all the time automatically. That's what we do. That's what our brains do, right? And those experiences are meaningful when those emotions are provoked. Then, possibly, imaginaries can be provoked, and maybe imaginaries can help us understand that transformation that may or may not happen. How does that imaginary then translate into action that people take later in their everyday lives? How they vote, how they behave, what conservation they do or don't do. So I think that this analytic can be really helpful in the further exploration that I think is needed to understand transformation in audiences and whether or not that actually walks into behavior change. So far for me, this is all theoretical. So where I'd like to go with this is I'd really like some empirical data. And what I mean by that is I'm an ethnographer, so I mostly look at stories and what people say and what people do, and stories about what people say and what they do. I would like to explore beyond Disney, and I would love to explore beyond the United States and get some other cultural representation in there. That's who I am. I have 1 minute and 23 seconds left. Would you like to talk about it? Here's my references. Yes, on the collaborators. I'm open to all kinds of data. I am a qualitative researcher, so I'm tending to look for stories, but not just stories like what people think immediately after Flight of Passage, but like what do they think 3 years later? Or like I look for stories, and when people mention, For example, if I have a conversation with anybody about artificial intelligence long enough, they're talking to me about Frankenstein, and they're talking to me about iRobot, and so I want to explore that kind of story work. I'm just not sure how to get to that data or those people, and listen for when those stories come up and when they're telling me about how they made decisions about XYZ thing. Did that answer your question? But I'm also open to other types. Okay, I have 8 seconds. That's not long enough. So thank you. I'll be around all day. I would love to talk to you.